but undeniable, was the echo of his insult, a moment where she paused, extended her hand outward as though offering something fragile, then pulled it back to her heart and spun away, leaving the imaginary weight behind. No one clapped mid-performance. They couldn't. They were too stunned. The final sequence built slowly, her movements accelerating into a series of turns so fast her dress flared like a halo. And then, abruptly, she stopped center stage, breathing hard, eyes lifted. Not to Daniel, not to anyone, but upward, as though acknowledging something higher than the room's approval. And the music faded into silence so complete it roared. For Heartbeat, nothing happened. Then applause erupted. Not polite, not restrained, but thunderous, rising from every corner, guests surging to their feet in a standing ovation that felt less like appreciation and more like awakening. Daniel did not clap at first. He stood frozen, grappling with the collapse of his assumption, the unsettling realization that status had blinded him, that the hierarchy he relied upon was thinner than glass. Isabella bowed once, simply, and as the lights brightened, the spell did not break. People rushed forward, asking her name, praising her talent, demanding to know where she had trained, and the event manager stared at her as though she had conjured a miracle. Daniel finally stepped closer, drawn by something he couldn't label. "You didn't tell me," he said quietly when she stood before him again, no longer kneeling but eye to eye. She held his gaze. "You didn't ask." The simplicity of it struck harder than accusation. He searched for the arrogance he'd worn earlier and found it ill-fitting. "I owe you an apology." She tilted her head slightly. "You owe yourself a broader view." A nearby guest, a renowned arts philanthropist, overheard and interjected enthusiastically about funding, about auditions, about connections to major companies, and suddenly Isabella's postponed someday was no longer abstract. Business cards pressed into her hand, promises formed in rapid succession, and Daniel watched as the room recalibrated around her, the axis shifting irreversibly. But the twist no one expected came hours later, when most guests had departed and the skyline glittered beyond the glass walls. Isabella had changed back into her uniform to finish her shift, refusing to leave her coworkers short-staffed despite the offers swirling around her, and Daniel found her again near the service entrance, where the glamour faded into fluorescent practicality. "Why are you still working?" he asked, genuinely perplexed. She shrugged lightly. "Because I said I would." He hesitated, then confessed something he had never told a stranger, that his late mother had been a pianist who gave up her concert career to support his father's ambitions, that he had grown up watching quiet sacrifice mistaken for insignificance, and that somewhere along the line he had learned to equate power with volume. "Tonight," he admitted, "you reminded me of her." Isabella listened, seeing not the air, but the human. "Then remember this," she said softly. "Talent doesn't disappear because someone calls it small." In the weeks that followed, videos of her performance, captured by dozens of phones, spread across social media, igniting conversations nationwide about hidden potential and the dignity of labor. And invitations poured in from dance companies, talk shows, foundations, and Daniel found himself in an unfamiliar position. Not at the center, but at the edge, watching as the woman he had dismissed stepped into rooms that once would have excluded her. Yet the greatest twist unfolded when Isabella, after securing a contract with a prominent contemporary troupe, announced that her first major project would not be a solo spotlight, but a collaborative foundation providing art scholarships to service workers and their children, funded partially by an anonymous donor who, in a private act of atonement, matched every contribution dollar for dollar. When reporters eventually uncovered that the donor was Daniel Whitmore, speculation swirled about redemption arcs and romantic subplots. But the truth was simpler and more powerful. Respect had replaced condescension. Awareness had replaced arrogance. And two lives had intersected not for fairy tale romance, but for transformation. Years later, at the grand opening of a performing arts center built in Brooklyn, where her childhood theater once stood crumbling, Isabella took the stage again, not in borrowed fabric, but in a gown of her choosing. And as she addressed a crowd that included politicians, artists, and former coworkers from catering shifts long past, she recounted none of the humiliation, none of the insult. Instead, she spoke about the danger of underestimation, about the quiet rooms where dreams wait patiently, about the moment someone dares to move despite being unseen. Daniel stood in the audience, applauding without hesitation this time. understanding that the most profound shift that night in the penthouse had not been the room falling silent. It had been the shattering of a belief he didn't realize he carried. The belief that worth could be ranked. And if there is a lesson stitched through every step she took across that marble floor, it is this. The titles we assign each other are fragile things, easily broken by courage. And the person you overlook today may be the one who teaches you tomorrow how small your vision once was. So remember Isabella the next time you measure someone by their uniform. Remember the silence before the applause. Remember that greatness often stands quietly at the edges waiting for a single note of music to begin. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you that respect costs nothing but means everything, then subscribe and stay. Because there are countless more stories where the underestimated rise, where rooms fall silent, and where the world tilts in favor of those who refuse to remain just anything. Stop scrolling, because the next few minutes could change the way you see power, pride, and the people you overlook every single day. If you believe in stories where dignity rises, where silence becomes thunder, and where the underestimated rewrite the rules, then hit subscribe right now and stay with me, because this is not just a story about humiliation. It's about a moment so electrifying it shattered an entire room's certainty in a single heartbeat. He humiliated her for being just a servant, and he did it with the careless confidence of a man who had never been told no in his life, the kind of man who inherited wealth like eye color and wore entitlement like a tailored suit. And on that glittering Manhattan evening, beneath chandeliers dripping with crystal light in a penthouse overlooking the Hudson, he decided she was invisible until she moved. The party was already loud with laughter that sounded expensive, glasses clinking with imported champagne, conversations about mergers and art deals and political favors weaving through the air like perfume, and Isabella moved quietly among them with a silver tray balanced effortlessly in her hands, her uniform crisp, her posture straight, her expression calm but distant, as though her mind lived somewhere far beyond the walls of that towering building. She had been working events since she was 16, ever since her mother fell ill and medical bills turned their modest Brooklyn apartment into a battlefield of overdue notices. And she had learned quickly that invisibility was armor, that silence was protection, and that dignity did not require acknowledgement from those who believed they owned the world. Daniel Whitmore stood at the center of it all that night, tall, immaculately groomed, heir to Whitmore Holdings, a real estate empire that shaped skylines, and he thrived on attention the way others required oxygen. He had returned from London that week after closing a deal that would be splashed across financial headlines by morning, and this party was as much a celebration as it was a declaration that he had arrived, that he was untouchable, that every eye should be on him. And they were, until one small human moment threatened the illusion. Isabella reached his circle just as he was finishing a story about a yacht mishap in Monaco, and as she extended the tray, a guest shifted abruptly, his elbow clipping the underside, and a single glass tipped, then another, and before she could correct the balance, champagne cascaded like liquid gold onto the polished marble floor and splashed against Daniel's imported Italian shoes. The music didn't stop, but the laughter did, replaced by that sharp intake of breath that signals approaching drama, and Isabella immediately knelt, apologizing softly, reaching for linen napkins from her apron, her hands steady despite the dozen eyes boring into her back. But Daniel stepped backward, as though she had contaminated the air itself. "Unbelievable," he said, loud enough to command the room, his voice cutting through the jazz band's melody. "They really will hire just about anyone these days." A few uncomfortable chuckles fluttered from the edges of the crowd. Isabella kept her gaze lowered. "I'm sorry, sir." He looked at his shoes, then at her, and something about her composure irritated him further, as if her calm was defiance. "Do you even understand how much these cost? Or is that beyond the scope of someone who serves drinks for a living?" The words landed heavier than the spill. Someone murmured, "Daniel, it's fine." But he wasn't finished. "It's always the same. Careless. Replaceable. Just a servant." The phrase lingered, ugly and deliberate. Isabella paused then. Not dramatically, not rebelliously, but in a way that suggested she had heard far worse and survived it. She finished wiping the floor, rose with quiet grace, and met his eyes for the first time. And in that look there was no anger, only something far more unsettling. Certainty. "It won't happen again," she said. He smirked. "See that it doesn't." The band resumed its volume. conversation crawled back to life, and Isabella retreated toward the service corridor, her heartbeat finally betraying her composure as it hammered against her ribs. Inside that narrow hallway lined with catering carts and coat racks, she closed her eyes for 3 seconds, just 3, and inhaled the memory of another room, another floor, another life. One where chandeliers were replaced with peeling paint and cracked mirrors. But the applause had been real, where her mother had once sat in the front row of a community theater and cried as Isabella performed her first solo at age 9, where dance had not been luxury, but language. She had trained in ballet and contemporary for years, earning a scholarship to a prestigious arts academy, until the scholarship wasn't enough and responsibility outweighed passion, and she folded her dreams carefully, like costumes placed in storage, telling herself someday, someday, someday. That night, someday cracked open unexpectedly. The event manager, frantic about the spilled drinks and the tension brewing among donors, rushed into the corridor. "We need a distraction," he muttered, half to himself. "The guest performer is stuck in traffic. This is a disaster." Isabella hesitated, the idea forming before she could stop it. "I can dance," she heard herself say. He blinked at her uniform. "What?" "I trained for 12 years. Ballet. Contemporary. I can fill 10 minutes. No one needs to know." He stared, weighing risk against desperation, then looked toward the ballroom where Daniel's laughter had resumed at full volume. "Fine," he said abruptly. "But if this goes wrong—" "It won't," she replied, surprising even herself with the steadiness in her voice. 5 minutes later, the lights dimmed unexpectedly, and murmurs rippled through the guests as the band quieted. Daniel frowned, glancing toward the stage area where a single spotlight flickered on, illuminating a lone figure now dressed not in a server's uniform, but in a simple ivory dress borrowed hastily from a coat check attendant. Her hair loosened from its tight bun so it cascaded around her shoulders like dark silk. He didn't recognize her at first. The room shifted into curious silence. Then the first notes of music began, soft piano, haunting and slow, and Isabella moved. Not tentatively, not shyly, but with the controlled ferocity of someone reclaiming stolen air. Her arms cut through space with precision. Her feet glided across marble as though it were a grand stage, and every turn carried a story of swallowed pride and deferred dreams. And within seconds, the room that had buzzed with shallow conversation fell utterly still, because what unfolded before them was not entertainment, it was revelation. She danced like gravity was optional, like pain could be sculpted into beauty, like humiliation could be alchemized into art. And Daniel felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest as recognition dawned. The servant he had dismissed was commanding a room filled with CEOs and socialites without speaking a single word. When she leapt, it was as if the ceiling itself had lifted to make room. When she landed, it was with a softness that belied the force beneath, and her expression transformed from quiet endurance to blazing defiance. And somewhere in the choreography, subtle but undeniable, was the echo of his insult.